Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Barry Bergdoll and introduce him as our lecturer this evening. He is our James Cox Distinguished Lecturer, and this lecture was named in honor of James Cox, who was a professor here at UVA, a professor of architectural history from 1967 until his retirement in 1990. He came from England. He was beloved by his students and taught them not only about the history of architecture, but also about art, design, and culture. And he also apparently led many international excursions with students to expose them to a larger world, its architecture and cultural artifacts. The lecture started in 2012 by friends and former students of Cox's, and some of whom are with us this evening, so I wanted to thank you all for your support for this lecture. It's been a great privilege to have the visitors that we've had. Our lecturer, Barry Bergdoll, is the Meyer Schapiro Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University and a curator of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he was the Philip Johnson Chief Curator from 2007 to 14. And although this lecture was intended to bring international visitors to the school, and our guest this evening is coming from New York, even though I'll argue New York is a kind of country unto itself. Bergdoll's global perspective and scholarship, his deep understanding of architectural history and of the importance of the relationship of architecture to its larger cultural context of design makes him an ideal candidate for this talk. I also argued that since he got a degree from Cambridge, that was his connection back to James Cox in England. And given that a large percentage of our graduates from our architectural history program also go on to be curators at museums, institutes, and galleries, we're very excited to have Barry here tonight with us for his talk, Immovable Paradoxes, Thoughts on the Power of Architecture in the Art Gallery. Barry is a specialist in the history of modern architecture with a particular emphasis on France and Germany since 1800. He has curated numerous major exhibitions at the MoMA, which include such landmark shows as Home Delivery, Fabricating the Modern Dwelling, which included full-scale fabrications on the empty lot next to the museum, Mies in Berlin, which was exhibited in New York, Barcelona, and Berlin, Rising Currents, an image which is on the screen, projects for New York's Waterfront, which was a significant exhibition and publication addressing one of the most urgent challenges of the century, global warming and rising sea levels. And Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, co-curated with Reinhold Martin, which explored new possibilities for architecture, cities and suburbs, following the aftermath of the financial and housing crisis in 2009. And this project, which brought together architects, a kind of interdisciplinary team of architects, landscape architects, ecologists, engineers, were brought together to envision new housing and transit infrastructures to catalyze urban transformation, where a number of teams worked as artists in residence to develop proposals for 5 mega regions across the country. And when you think about this as a kind of model for curation, in many ways this exhibition and others exemplify the complexity of thinking behind Barry's work as a curator. He was also instrumental in consolidating and bringing the Frank Lloyd Wright archives to MoMA and curating an enormous show called Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, Unpacking the Archives, and his curatorial work is also extended to many other museums, including the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal, and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, among many others. And of course, he's a scholar, an architectural historian and scholar first before a curator, and he's published 22 books and countless articles. His CV was 13,000 words, and I thought it was a book in itself and very impressive in that. He serves as the president of the Society of Architectural Historians. He's currently the president of the Center for Architecture in New York. a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and an honorary fellow at the Royal Institute of British Architects. He has also held numerous guest professorships at Harvard, at MIT, and the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Tonight we're going to try to convince him to become a visiting professor here at UVA to make all of my intentions sort of known in advance. He holds a BA and a PhD from Columbia and an MA from King's College in Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming Barry Bergdoll.
Thank you very much. We'll see if the offer is rescinded by the end of the hour or so. I'll run on and on and on, and you'll please don't come back. So I also am pleased to learn about James Cox. I didn't know him, but I'm also happy that my Cambridge connection can be evoked in that way. I want to give you tonight a very pragmatic lecture, and maybe a little bit too personal. It really has to do with the voyage of discovery of becoming a curator, because until quite recently, curators were not trained. There now are many, many programs for curating architecture, on which I have lots of thoughts if you want to ask me afterwards. But I am not trained as a curator. I am a historian who found my way into the museum through historical work. That'll weave into what I have to say in two ways. If you'll bear with me, both at the beginning and at the end, I've framed it historically. First of all, to talk to you about the history of architecture trying to get through the door of the museum. I gave a course last semester at Columbia, which was on called Architecture in and of the Museum, which was on the fact that architects build the museum and then knock at the door trying to get in. So we're going to look at a little bit of that history of trying to get into a place that they have designed but doesn't seem to really have a place for them, and how that works. And at the very end, because in this university, architectural history is primarily in the School of Architecture, I want also to talk about the Frank Lloyd Wright show that was just mentioned very briefly, because it was an experiment in how architectural history can take up what is the leitmotif of tonight, which is the history and application of the idea of the curator as activist. So Immovable Paradoxes is obviously relates, I thought would bring Virginia to Virginia. This is, of course, ARO working with D-Land Studio in the project Rising Currents, which was already evoked. We'll come back to this image. When we do, you'll know that we're about 1/3 of the way through the lecture if you want to set your watches or prepare your departure. So almost every history of architecture in the museum starts with some version of this notion of the immovable paradox, of the fact that you cannot exhibit architecture in a museum. You can only exhibit what was called in the inaugural exhibition of the Canadian Centre for Architecture when it's opened its doors some 30 years ago, its image. So it's only the image of architecture that can be allowed into the museum. Interesting that one of the earliest proposals to create a modern museum, this is the famous painting by the French painter Hubert Robert, proposing that the Grand Gallery of the Louvre Palace could be transformed into a gallery space for the public by adding skylighting and reconfiguring the space in some way. So it's very important in the history of museology. I also use it to represent the fact that Hubert Robert, who was both a painter and an architect, not only has the fantasy of all architects and artists that the museum would be a one-man show of his own work, but equally that architecture would enter into the museum through another medium. So here, Rome enters Paris through the medium of painting, the collection of the Grand Tour. How could architecture actually enter into the museum as experienced built space, with everything from the tectonics to the spatial sequencing and the things that many of you in the room can read in architectural representation but are not immediately palpable for the general public? I take an extreme example, which is to take the museum to the building on the right. This is the display case, so we can take the apparatus of the museum and take it out in the world. This is the very large display case that was built around a historical artifact. It's the home of the first Argentinian president, Sarmiento, in the Delta district of the Tigre district of Buenos Aires, which as a preservation strategy, was put into a display case in order to house both the building and the thousands of tourists who come to visit it every summer. So you could take the museum out in terms of its apparatus, or other ways, you could take the whole apparatus of what is the most controversial subject in any art museum, I assure you, the content of the labels and the wall text. You can take that out and try to turn the city here, Miami and New York, with these texts, and many of them, if you read them, read like museum labels. They've been through so many editing jobs that they don't really say much of anything anymore in under 200 words. Or here is an example that combines both. This was a building that I visited in Medellin in Colombia during the many years of preparation for the Latin American show at MoMA. This is a posthumous work by the Colombian architect Rogelio Salmona, a cultural center in Moravia, which is a rather poor district of Medellin, designed by Salmona, but completed after his death. There you see the dedication plaque, and curated. So each space in the museum has a label. You don't even have to figure out for yourself that these mirrors of water are an evocation of the patio of traditional Hispanic architecture, translation here into the New World, or before you take any delight in this Corbusian ramp, you are told that a ramp is obviously in order to enjoy time. So this is a building that has been curated with the apparatus of the museum. So those are some examples of perhaps the extremes to which the almost immovable, untransferable, traversable, divide between the museum and architecture might be in some way breached. A number of years ago, I was invited to the National Gallery in Washington to give the Mellon Lectures. I'm now working on converting those into a book, and I chose as my subject, here's the title of the lecture series and the future book, Out of Sight, you need to see it, not just hear it, Out of Sight, in Plain View, a history of exhibiting architecture since 1750. I'm not going to do that for you right now. That is when it starts, and it's a very, very interesting origin. And I was, once I'd chosen the subject, I thought, now, am I really going to spend the next 6 weeks with this audience, chasing them all from the auditorium by rehearsing the fact that you can't exhibit architecture? And I began to make an Excel spreadsheet of important exhibitions on architecture since architecture broke into the gallery in the 1750s in very interesting circumstances. And what I noticed was that I was accumulating more and more and more, number one, and number two, that none of them looked like one another. And I began to think, what if I turned this proposition around? So if you want to read this book in a year or so, this is its central thesis. If I turn this proposition around, instead of saying it's impossible to exhibit architecture, only simulacra or representations or images can be exhibited, not space, not buildings, that is simply going to be to beat an almost dead horse. Rather, I asked myself the question, if it's so impossible, why has it proliferated continuously for over 250 years? What is it, positively, that exhibitions have provided for architecture, both the profession and its publics, that have made people want to confront over and over again this difficult issue of trying to explore architecture? We're going to look at a moment at that in relationship to the Museum of Modern Art, which, despite its name modern, is in fact the oldest continuous architecture department anywhere in the world. There were earlier ones, but they didn't survive, so it was a risky thing to create a museum with a permanent department dedicated to architecture. We're going to fast forward to that in a moment. In a way, when I was asked in 2007 to come to MoMA to take over the Department of Architecture and Design, I didn't immediately pose the question of trying to understand this history, or, for that matter, how it was that one would breach the gap that I just cited. Rather, this is a photograph taken on the morning of my arrival. So you've all been to MoMA. You know that this is 10:30 in the morning because hardly anybody is there. Right? This is an uncrowded moment in the Taniguchi building. I'm juxtaposing it here with the icon of Architizer, which means that if you get bored during this lecture, you could go onto Architizer, you could open up a kind of pin interest thing on your phone, and you could begin to curate, as we say now, because one curates everything. You curate your food experience at the food court, you curate your music collection, and so you could curate an architectural exhibition yourself while I'm speaking. So why bother to even confront this issue, since the iPhone and my arrival at MoMA are nearly contemporaneous? I decided to put the question aside for a moment, and so these are my reflections on why continue to do this. Partly the answer is, look at the number of people there who don't know that they are interested in architecture. They are a captive audience. We're going to try to get their attention while they're looking for Jackson Pollock. So we might also say that in one of the interesting phenomena of the last 30 years or so has been the proliferation of institutions dedicated to exhibiting architecture. So it is now a very substantial genre of architectural institutions. I'm only showing you 4 here. The Cité de l'Architecture in Paris, which had a long and difficult birth, but finally in this absolutely beautiful installation at Trocadero. The nearly contemporary German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt, a view inside the galleries of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, founded in 1979, and then probably the youngest, Rem Koolhaas's new Architecture Center in Copenhagen, down there. So we do have an explosion of purpose-built museums for architecture. They don't have the built-in crowds, so they have a kind of upward task to handle. Let's have a little bit of a momentary history until I move up to my heroine, who I have adopted as my role model. When a portrait appears, you will recognize her. We're in 1932 at MoMA. After 3 years of arguing, Alfred Barr, the very young founding director of the museum, and his friends, equally young Philip Johnson and slightly older Henry Russell Hitchcock, an architectural historian, finally convinced the trustees to take an experiment on the road and to try to have an architecture exhibition. This had been proposed by Barr when the museum was founded in 1929, but originally the trustees rejected this, saying it's impossible to exhibit architecture. How would you bring it into the gallery? So they rehearsed that experiment as well. But finally, in 1932, they were convinced to give it a try. One of the many myths of the so-called international style exhibition, which we'll see in a moment, is that it is the first exhibition of the Department of Architecture at MoMA. It was not. It was an attempt. First of all, it wasn't the first exhibition. And secondly, it was an attempt to see if anyone would come, and then there would be a department created on the basis of the success or not of this 1932 show. I show you here the first page of the foreword of the book that accompanied the exhibition. We'll get to that in a moment. It's not the book that you think it is. It's not Hitchcock and Johnson, the International Style. Rather, this is the catalog of the exhibition. And I want to read for you, this is the only time I'll do this evening, the first line. Expositions and exhibitions have perhaps changed the character of American architecture of the last 40 years more than any other factor. That line for me is so important because it's, first of all, you have to figure out what is 40 years, but the initiating exhibition at MoMA is not an initiating exhibition. It says already, we are in discussion with an established culture. So part of my book is to try to establish that culture and to understand the fact that by the time the MoMA Department of Architecture and Design finally gets on its feet, that it is in what Foucault would have called a discursive space among other exhibitions. The reference is obviously to the World's Columbian Exhibition of 1893, sorry, and this is then the fledgling beginnings of not only a department, but a theory of exhibiting architecture. By about 40 years later, Peter Blake, who was briefly a curator in the Department of Architecture, architect, architectural historian, architect critic, curmudgeon, wrote this article under the headline, Architecture is an Art and MoMA is its Prophet. And indeed, that was, it seemed to many, to Barr, to Hitchcock and Johnson, what they were trying to establish. was that architecture was indeed an art. It had a place in a museum of modern art, along with other media that had not yet been admitted into the museum, photography, film, and some of the other departments that were created over the course of the 1930s in order that the museum might reflect the activities of the avant-garde school of the Bauhaus that Barr had said was his biggest inspiration. He wanted to turn the Bauhaus into a museum, seeming paradoxical idea, but very interesting that his model was not other museums, but this experimental art, architecture, and design school from the 20s in Germany. The first housing of the museum was in this building. You all know it in color in New York. I bring you an old black and white so that you can see the context, and also you don't have the gilding put on there by Mrs. Helmsley some years ago, but that gilding is right on the gallery space, which was right here, of the Museum of Modern Art when it opened in 1929 until the end of 1932. That means extremely important because the context, both architectural and institutional, for these exhibitions is enormously important. The Architectural League was having annual exhibitions. There were places where you could see architecture, but to insist that this experimental new art museum that was dedicated to the concept of the modern would include architecture, and to ascend the elevator inside this neo-French Renaissance envelope to arrive into a set of galleries and to see these buildings was part of the impact that was orchestrated in order to introduce this idea that there was an epic-making new moment in architecture. It was largely housed in Europe, and as the catalog explained, it was every bit as consequential for the 20th century as the emergence of Gothic was for the 12th and the 13th. In fact, it was the program to get with. We all know that, this attempt, in a sense, to change taste, to convert not only public taste, but most importantly, to convert the taste of bankers and clients and people who might hire a group of young American architects who were also featured in this exhibition. Here's the Corbusier room. You can see how conservative the installation is. Everything was rephotographed and hung as like a frameless picture, all in a line, with the models treated the same way sculptures were in other galleries. This gave rise to two books, and I think very interesting if this were a lecture in 20th century architecture to look at the radical difference between these two books and all of the myths that have arisen because most people have judged the exhibition not on its checklist or on its contents, but on this book, which was not published by MoMA, that is related to the exhibition but quite different in its contents. Interestingly, the actual catalog from which I just quoted had an entire part on young American architects, as well as, and this is where we're going to turn in a moment, a very major emphasis on the problem of housing and on the housing crisis. We're 1932, so we're 3 years into the Depression. In fact, we're getting into the depths of the Depression at quite that point. Not exactly the moment to open an art museum, perhaps, but more on that in a moment. This on display technique. Just to show how conservative the display technique is of this. I mean, look at this with these canvas, these little canvas skirts around the base to hide the electricity for the little lights that are going to light up the label. One of the models could also be lit. This is the exact same model. Look at how Herbert Bayer exhibited that model in Paris at the Grand Palais in this environmental surround you with imagery, a kind of notion that since we're not dealing with precious objects, paintings, and sculptures from which we're going to have a detachment for a moment of aesthetic encounter. Rather, we're dealing with information, and also we're dealing with the creation of an environment. I think it was Herbert Bayer who was one of the earliest to realize that an architecture exhibition is itself an architecture, and that an architecture curator is quite different from an art curator, because rather than being recessive and respectful in relationship to the work of art that is put on a pedestal and displayed, something that's kind of going on here, the architecture curator needs to create an environment, needs to create a spatial excitement, needs to find an equivalent to the message of what is on display, and therefore needs to create an environment. This is in some way the way that architecture will indeed enter into the gallery. So Herbert Bayer begins actually on the basis of that exhibition. This is the catalog of the exhibition, which includes the design of the exhibition in 1930 as part of the catalog, and explains this idea of the kind of roving eye, peripheral vision, and an idea that he would experiment with. We'll see that model reappear in just a moment. But to continue with the 1932 show, here we see the same model in New York, installed by Herbert Bayer now in 1938 in the last temporary home of the Museum of Modern Art. The building that you all know on 53rd Street was under construction for the first time in 38, 39. It opened in 39, so we're in the fall of 1938, and the museum, which was always a Rockefeller family affair, is been given unrentable space in the not yet completed concourse of Rockefeller Center, so that people on their way to the D train will pass by the Museum of Modern Art. We try to convince Glenn Lowry that this is a good idea for this summer when the museum is going to be closed again. And Herbert Bayer installs an exhibition as a shopfront attraction, and it's a Bauhaus exhibition. But by this point, one doesn't need to say Bauhaus. It's clearly expressed by the model, an absolutely brilliant, amazing design for experiencing the Bauhaus. But we're in 1938, so it's a bit of a memento mori. It's a bit of a protest against Hitler and the Degenerate Art Show. It's a beginning of also a moment in which the Museum of Modern Art will be, for a couple of decades, quite politically engaged. But now we're going to meet in the context of that 1932 exhibition. Oh, right, I didn't realize this appears first. We'll meet it in a moment. So right after that exhibition closes, the museum opens in an embodiment of the principles of the international style, which had been defined in the inaugural show. I like this photograph because I always feel as though they're waiting for Corbusier to make his first visit, and like every tourist today, he will know already from the airplane, because he does all of his city planning already before he arrives from the airplane, exactly where to go. 11 West 53rd Street, where 3 townhouses had just been demolished in order to be replaced, not by Barr's preference, a new building by Mies van der Rohe, but rather one by Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone, but very radical in its time. Of course, if you see the adjacent brownstones here, just off of Fifth Avenue with their high stoops, the ground floor entrance. This is one of the first museums ever built that is entered directly from the sidewalk through a glass revolving door, which is the language of shops and banks and maybe tailors, Lord & Taylor, things like that, with this canopy and a translucent, partly transparent ground floor. So taking over in a certain way the legacy of the shop architecture of Rockefeller Center, but bringing it to create a museum which will experiment with a different accessibility to the public. Now, one gallery at the very back of this, these were monographic exhibitions on Le Corbusier, Mies, etc., was dedicated to housing. And this is the beginning. In fact, this is a room that is incredibly important to everything else I have to say tonight, and was incredibly important to my 10 years at MoMA, orchestrated by Louis Mumford and a very young person who we'll meet in a moment, Catherine Bauer, dedicated to housing. This is a really daring thing to do, because everything on the wall up until this point is a model of what you should do, and this is a model of what's the matter with America. These are views of slums, of conditions that they want improved, contrasted with is a housing estate in Kassel in Germany to modernist housing estates, state-sponsored for the most part, in Germany. So it is a manifesto for housing. It's going to lead to a series of projects. I'm going to show you just one, including one called Can America Have Housing? It is therefore a critique of both the reigning political situation and a demand for an engaged architecture that can deal with it. It takes the attempt of, in a sense, going back to Pugin's contrast, showing you good and bad. This is a whole interesting issue if museums can show things that are bad, because usually once something enters into the door of a museum, it's automatically good. So to hang something that you want to be disapproved in a museum that had failed at the early Victorian Albert when they tried to do a gallery version of Pugin's contrasts, but here it returns. Here she is, the youthfulness of the young curators at MoMA in her 20s, Catherine Bauer. By the mid-30s, She has published Modern Housing, which remains a reference point up until this day. And I have taken her as my heroine, as a kind of prototype of the activist curator, the activist architectural curator. She will play a major role in this exhibition in 1934, the housing exhibition of the city of New York. It took place, if I go back here for a second, in this building, there. So this was kind of middle class or upper middle class house on 53rd Street, and you entered into it, and you see all the moldings from it, the interior in this temporary headquarters on 53rd, so we're before the Bauhaus exhibition, with incredible innovation. She takes over all of the super graphics of German exhibition design, so we don't need to wait for Rem Koolhaas for the idea of the exhibition as information display. Super graphics, timelines, kind of evocation of film. Here, there is exactly where it was. So imagine we enter this building, and we come upon this. We can go either right or left. If we go left, we are going to go into a room that has been removed from a slum dwelling in demolition on East 87th Street and moved part and partial with its furniture, and until the Department of Health demanded that they be removed, its cockroaches from Yorkville. And on the right, a model apartment dwelling in the new style, complete with tubular steel furniture, everything that MoMA was promoting, a library of books. The family that lives here has a copy of the international style. As we move beyond that, we get a series of projects that are proposed for New York. This is housing for the Lower East Side, the Christie Forsyth housing by William Lescaz and others. That is a proposal under review by New York City, and the museum organized a series of events to bring city officials there so that the curators could explain to them the qualities and advantages of this architecture. So an activism that is not simply passive by putting things on display, but is actually active in engaging with decision makers, but not only decision makers, obviously information made very readily available. And in this, the very last room, which had a real property inventory of the city of New York, but also had a desk for a person to sit and consult with you about rents and mortgages. So you don't need to wait for the 21st century for relational aesthetics. It was invented by Catherine Bauer, Mumford, and others already at MoMA in an activist architectural exhibition in the 30s. So these people are very inspiring to me. When I went to MoMA as a historian, I quickly began to delve into the history of the museum. But as a newly minted curator, I was eager for the ways in which history could, in a certain way, fortify what I wanted to do. Because needless to say, over and over again, people would say, this is not MoMA. MoMA had taken on such an aura. MoMA doesn't do this. MoMA doesn't do that. So I would say, actually, it's not true. In 1937, there was a housing exhibition moved into slum dwelling. Actually, that's not true. And I was also astounded, even if you turn to textbooks where MoMA exhibitions occur, how almost anyone probably in this room could name 3 or 4, but it's always the same 3 and 4, even though there have been several hundred exhibitions. So that residue of the other sort of 280, if you will, gave me a lot of power to interpret what I wanted to do as something that was in the DNA of MoMA. And I like to think that Catherine Bauer is very present. If we were to send her saliva to the Mormons to have it investigated, it would come back that there was an activism in the DNA of MoMA. Just some more examples of the history. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, the inaugural architecture exhibition in the new building. You see him standing in front of the curtain wall to the garden with these models. These are some of the ones that have just come back with the transfer of his archives. You can see why it's very dangerous to work with living architects, because Frank Lloyd Wright pulled up in a truck and delivered a set of drawings that had nothing to do with the checklist that had been sent some weeks before, and quite typically continued to draw them in situ while his assistant, Eugene Masslink, held his walking stick. But he did a very interesting thing, because he said, I'm turning the museum into a studio. I'm going to create the environment of the way I work. I'm going to have drawings on tables. I'm going to pin them up on the wall. I'm going to have you enter into the working space of the way I conceive my work. So that you're going to see it coming back. I find that very inspirational. This is Brazil Builds of 1943, just to show you some of the others. This is Philip Johnson and Mies van der Rohe standing in front of a supermural of the Tugendhat House in the Mies van der Rohe exhibition in 1947, which had a wonderful phrase. The curatorial assistant for this, by the way, was Ada Louise Huxtable. She was a young employee of MoMA. She told me that she had two tasks. She wrote the wall labels, in which she said, this exhibition is the most recent work of architecture by Mies van der Rohe. And then, because she was a woman at the museum, she feather dusted the show every morning before it opened to the public. But we had a wonderful conversation about this before she died. But I think interesting to put Johnson and Mies here together. This is Mies looking in on Edith Farnsworth at the Farnsworth House. But I like to put it with this quote that Johnson comes up with around the same time: the art of exhibiting is a branch of architecture and should be practiced as such. So these incredible photo murals, furniture that you could sit down on, even real samples of the buildings at IIT that were just coming up, although here the steel is actually built in wood. And a kind of sense that you could enter into, rather poignantly, the Barcelona pavilion, which was long demolished. And one last example, because very important for me, I looked at the statistics of how different architecture exhibitions had done. The 1932 Modern Architecture, so-called International Style Show, had a very high attendance, but that was because it went on a very long tour across the country, and those had been accumulated. The largest attendance of any show of architecture in the museum actually did not take place in the galleries, but was the third of three houses in the garden that began after the war in relationship to how America would face the post-Second World War housing crisis, particularly with the return of the GIs, rising incomes, and the movement to suburbia. So here, shortly before, the husband of a married couple about to have 2.4 children went to Grand Central. He would check in at MoMA and see Marcel Breuer's design for a binuclear house, this butterfly plan, this weird, surreal image of a house intended for Westchester County or Long Island in the garden at MoMA. So the garden here serving as a place to take up a long tradition of the model house, the model furnished house, extremely influential, extremely discussed, and because it had its own separate entrance, you see here for only 35 cents and extended hours, the most visited architecture exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art until I stole the idea, you'll see in a moment, and repeated it, because I know people like to look at other people's houses, and you can fool them into thinking that they're looking at other people's houses rather than architecture. And then they're discussing the houses, and they're discussing architecture without knowing that they're discussing architecture. So the architecture curator is also always something in a public setting as opposed to professional setting, something of a trickster to try to get people interested in the most public and consequential art form that we have, but one that many people find extremely difficult to relate to. Very rich history. Richard Guy Wilson's here, so we have the Architecture of the École des Beaux-Arts, which he's carrying the brochure. 1975. Few realize this is an exhibition that was a monumental failure, because few realize that Arthur Drexler's intent was to jumpstart a debate on urban renewal and on abstract representation in schools of architecture. Rather, it gave rise to a kind of postmodern classicism that he later regretted. On the right, interesting contrast, Rudovsky's Architecture Without Architects. Okay, now I'm going to get, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, a little bit autobiographical. So what have I done with all this history? Some of the exhibitions Isla already cited. This is MoMA on an average day. Look at all of these people. They cannot see Starry Night. There is a chance that they might accidentally end up in the architecture gallery. And that is, this was a very visited exhibition, by the way. It's only been recently that we've managed to convince the photography department inside the exhibitions department that they could take views of our shows with people in them, rather than empty as a kind of an architecture that hasn't yet been opened. This was home delivery that Isla evoked. I wanted to do, so when I first went to MoMA, I had come from the euphoria of Bernard Shumi's years at Columbia, the notion of the paperless studio, the idea that there was a huge paradigm shift. One of the big, or two, I say, of the biggest discussions going on, were in 2007, so a little over a decade ago, was the paradigm shift that would accompany the addition of computer-aided manufacturing, computer-aided fabrication, beyond simply computer-aided design. And also the notion of mass customization as finally overriding not only mass standardization, but evoking a return to the possibility of the factory-built house as something that could be customizable through mass customization. And I wanted to look at something of that, both in a way to bring that argument and discussion into the museum, but also in a way to contest the notion, this has always been my role in relationship to architecture schools, that everything is brand new. I'm a kind of wrecker of novelty claims. So I wanted to look at the history of what was always the next best thing, the idea that architects could design prototypes that would be produced in factories, and look at the history of it. And I would say, I'll show you in a moment well, there you see the views of the interior galleries. And I wanted also, of course, it was a moment when it was announced that an architectural historian was going to take over from Terry Riley, there was an enormous amount of nervousness. What would a historian of 19th century French architecture do to the museum? So I wanted to create a show that you couldn't say in the end whether it was a historical show or a contemporary show, one that didn't accept that there was any necessary division between contemporary preoccupations and history. And indeed, it always seems to me that history is continuously reactivated by the present, so that the history of prefabrication becomes enormously interesting, not simply as the origins or genesis or prelude to what might be experiments of the moment 10 years ago, but also because those things that were rejected as historical failures in 1950 and 1960, when you bring them back into consideration, often turn out to have potent experiments that are meaningful again in a new context. So that, in a way, the historical past is continually changing in relationship to the present. And I wanted to use the present moment in order both to frame the present moment but to rethink of the past. So I staged two exhibitions that were interrelated. One was a historical survey inside the museum, and one was the display of 5 new or relatively new prototypes. Some prototypes, one actually in production, this little micro cube house by the now late Richard Horden of London and Munich. This is, of course, Kieran Timberlake's house, one that came from Austria. But I don't want to get into the details of this exhibition or relate it to you, but simply to say that I stole the idea of a visitable house as something that would get people interested in complex questions of the stakes of fabrication and the stakes of replication in the early 21st century. And so that before people knew it, they were looking at digital production because they thought they'd come to look at somebody else's house. But unlike the International Style Show, which said everything that we've collected in this gallery has a stylistic unity, that was a real art historical operation to name a style and decide what's in, what's out. The only thing that unified all the objects that I brought together in this sort of mega show was that all of them had been designed in order to be replicated in a factory, and therefore all of them were also designed with a complete changing of the calendar of construction. So that one of the things that's so radical in prefabrication or its contemporary digital manifestations is that the preparation of the site and the preparation of the building components are all happening at the same time. So even the way in which you conceive of construction is completely changed. The only thing, therefore, in the end, that related everything that I brought together was this underlying way in which it was conceived and fabricated. There was no stylistic unity. What I wanted to exhibit was a process, and I also wanted to think about the difficulty of could an architectural exhibition exhibit design thinking and design process rather than simply outcomes? Would the things on display not be simply objects to be admired like paintings and sculpture, or could you in some way engage the viewer in what had been involved in conceiving and having made this product? And therefore, two things became really important to me, and we're going to see. One is film, and the other was the internet. it occurred to me that once even the houses outside arrived there, the fact of the way they came into being would be lost. So it at that point occurred to me that the exhibition was itself a process about process, and that I was going to create an exhibition that had a much longer time frame than the 4 months the museum gave me. Those 4 months would be the center of the exhibition, but the exhibition started with the choosing of the architects who were going to exhibit on the vacant lot. This is what is now occupied by the Jean Nouvel Tower that is going to open in the fall of this year with galleries on the lower floor. It was temporarily a vacant lot, and I had been lured to MoMA by being told that I could have this as an outdoor architecture gallery until such time as. And in fact, when Glenn Lowry phoned me and said, that show you're going to do in summer 2009, we just sold the lot, do it in 2008. So we had to pull this thing, just like prefabrication, we were suddenly on a speeded up process. But I needed the process to be part of it. So we started the exhibition on the internet 4 months before it began, and we had the spectacle of this site in the weeks leading up to the opening also as a public display. There you see Doug Gauthier and Jeremy Edmonston's building that's in the back there, completed, being delivered. Inside, I wanted all of the artifacts to be related, not by style, but by how they came into being. So we used hours of archival film, of fabrication, tracking the history of prefabrication in relationship to automobile construction, which is a dominant metaphor from, you can have any car you want as long as it's black, mass standardization to BMW in Leipzig now, which every car on the assembly line is different. It's being customized before your eyes to that in the digital environment. But to activate the whole space with images of production, of delivery, rather belatedly, I came up with the title of the show, Home Delivery, Fabricating the Modern Dwelling, and in fact, delivery was a good part of the site. The exhibition itself, as a process of thinking, became also part of the exhibition. And so this goes back to my opening slide of Architizer versus the museum. I realized that the internet is not the competition. It's just another medium that can be part of the panoply of what you use. So we opened this website and kept it active for about a year. And in the months leading up to the exhibition, on Monday through Friday, each one of the 5 houses posted something. So we followed the house from the design office to the factory, to the port in Hamburg, to its arrival in New York, to taking it across at 2 in the morning, George Washington Bridge, and then delivering it to MoMA. On Saturday, Peter Christensen and I said where we were in planning the exhibition, so the curators became also architects with their own thing. On Sunday, everybody rested, or pretended to, and like a kind of bad Andy Warhol, a camera was on the site at MoMA, and nothing was happening. Nothing was happening, nothing was happening, nothing was happening. And then about 21 days before the exhibition, this became frenetic. So then the website changed after the exhibition opened to inviting editorials and the like to continue to comment and to animate the discussion. One other was evoked. I'll go through it rather quickly, and then I want to have a coda, if you'll bear with me, to explain why this procedure of what I call kind of my particular brand of an activist exhibition, my homage to Catherine Bauer and to other predecessors, but in the internet age, can also be applied to the work of the architectural historian. I think this is not simply a format for creating new architecture, but the idea of the museum as commissioning something became more and more important. The backstory of this is perhaps interesting for you. Probably this has been discussed in this room because I think Adam Urinsky comes back from time to time to the school, so there is a UVA connection to one of the 5 interdisciplinary teams who were brought together in the project Rising Currents, which was staged in 2009, 2010. So soon 10 years ago, but important to point out 2 years before Superstorm Sandy. So we were not reacting to that, as I sometimes get the question. We were already worried about it before a version of it happened. It should be pointed out that despite common parlance, Sandy was not a hurricane. It was just a big storm. So it's going to get worse. Anyway, Rising Currents, the background of this is Guy Nordenson, an engineer, had undertaken a project. Maybe it's going to show up here, yes, which we actually published the results of a study he had done, sponsored by the AIA, the La Trobe Fellowship, about resiliency in coastal situations, making the more than 51% of the world's population that lives in floodable urban areas more resilient in order to deal with sea level rise, and not simply by building U.S. Army Corps of Engineer approved concrete walls, but looking at a panoply of also soft infrastructural methods. And he had done a lot of graphic work around this project, and he proposed it to me as an exhibition. And I said, this is incredible work, but I don't want to put a book on the wall. There are too many exhibitions that are simply books on the wall or just elaborate texts of research, which nobody ever reads beyond the third panel. No. The role of the museum is to exhibit architecture, so then we were sitting at the Venice Biennale in the end of August 2008, and he said, well, what if we got projects that we admire in Singapore and the Netherlands and put them up as well? And I said, okay, the international style infrastructure version, they do it better in Europe. And the newspaper that morning was Lehman Brothers is collapsing. I said, so we're going to tell all these young architects who are going to be out of work by the end of next week and are going to be designing websites that they do it better in Singapore. And that is going, that's not, and from that came the idea, so, well, if they're going to be out of work, what if we ask them to tackle the problem? So we gave this book all of Guy's analysis. I won't go through it, and this is Adam's response. I'm showing it here because this was in New York Magazine weeks before the show opened. Why? Because, again, taking over this idea of process into it was not a new idea. When MoMA said, oh, nobody's ever done that, you can't do it, you're going to exhaust the museum, we don't have the resources. I went to the Rockefeller Foundation, they a little bit lessened that, or eroded, let's say, that argument. But also, I said, no, 1967, museum staged an exhibition. They invited architecture schools to reimagine the city and to provide a critique of federal urban renewal, the new city. They staged it in the summer in the basement, but still, there it was. That was the prototype. And so we, instead of sending the teams back to architecture schools, we said, conceive of your dream team, interdisciplinary, whoever you want, landscape people, hydrologists, engineers, put together a dream team to work on one of the 5 sites we have. We're 5 teams, and we are going to install you for a 6-week intensive public workshop in PS1. Klaus Biesenbach had just told me, I have to close one wing. I don't want people to notice. I said, I'm going to put designers in. So we took over various spaces and left the doors open so that people could see that work was going on, and threw the doors open at various points for open house days for people to come and literally witness what is common nature to you, pinning your drawings up, having a discussion about them. But most members of the public think that architects come up with an arrogant design and impose it. I wanted actually them to have a contact with design thinking on a very, very important issue. And from that, this was one lesson that I'm drawing from these 10 years of experience, was I very rarely did a project in which I knew when I went into it what it was going to be. It occurred to me what I was doing in the process of doing it, I think very much like design. And it occurred to me that what a museum can do, and this is perhaps the one takeaway, is that a museum can pose a question that the marketplace doesn't pose to architecture. So that, again, is something you do in school all the time, but it ends when you leave. So that the museum can pose a absolutely vitally important question: how can architecture, landscape design, in an interdisciplinary way, respond to this issue? We know that the federal government, certainly not now, is not looking for this type of answer. And we know that inside the confines of an architecture office, it's a luxury to be able to work with a fully interdisciplinary way. So what if we can create a situation that does not exist in the market for the museum to take an activist position and discover new solutions, but also discover how they come about? We were learning along the way, so twice a week the teams put up what they were doing, and I invited in specialists, people, experts in bathymetry. I didn't even know the word the week before this project began. Experts in hydraulics, And then we also invited city officials. We said, you're not actually here as clients, but we want you to see what's going on. So it was a dual thing. It made the project seem all the more important. Particularly, there were a lot of very young people that were on these extended teams. So city officials coming from parks, from transportation, and the like, made it seem important, but it also made it so that the city was paying attention to it, and they began to follow this. So this is then the open house day. Teams are explaining, and then all of the work when it was finished. The whole project was 14 weeks from start to finish, and we designed the exhibition also together. So I'm not going to go into this in full detail because the hour is late. Adam's project has probably been discussed in the room before, but I'll just show you two that came out of it. But I think one of the most interesting things was that I would say that what ran across both the projects and the exhibition itself was a blurring of boundaries, a deliberate blurring of boundaries. So we began, not only was ARO here working with D-Land Studio, which is Susanna Drake, a landscape team, bringing together architecture and landscape. Of course, that happens in certain schools like this one, or Harvard, but it doesn't, or at least didn't a decade ago, happen that frequently in architectural practice. But also blurring the boundaries of what is the site. What was fascinating for us was realizing if you took a section of the site, you were not only taking a section of topography, but bathymetry. And so the relationship of that section right into the to the seafloor. So here what they're working with primarily is not only creating marshy, absorptive, park-like infrastructure that can be flooded and that can make Manhattan into what Suzanne would call a sponge, but they're also creating reefs out here to transform the floor of New York Harbor to make it rougher and to make it into something that can break the velocity of waves. So that dramatic footage of Superstorm Sandy flooding the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, this was 2 years ahead of time a proposal for how that tidal wave, which really gains force. If you think of New York as a disaster scenario, the VerrazanoNarrows increases the velocity of any sea surge that's coming in, and therefore it speeds to New York with a kind of unprecedented speed. There was a sort of back to the future aspect. We got people from the Natural History Museum, Eric Sanderson, who talks about the original ecology of Manhattan involved. And so a very, very interesting discussion happening within the groups, but we also wanted to keep that alive through programming. So these are their absorptive streets for combined C2O2. So interesting for me as a historian in this situation, because once they began to work on this, I said, you realize that this is in a history of thinking of the street and section as a functioning street. And so we really had very, very fascinating discussions, and we had them often in front of the public who came to watch the spectacle of this underway. Next time you land at Newark, look down at this oil refinery. It is partially below sea level. So we do not need to wait for a tanker to sink in New York Harbor for an ecological disaster. Another team took on transforming this area. But you've got the principle of, so this was an extension of thinking of probably the most extraordinary, this is a UVA connection as well, is Kate Orff, who took on the much-studied Gowanus Canal and the area between Governor's Island and the Brooklyn waterfront to think about a number of things. The Gowanus Canal is a super cleanup site. She proposes to put in working oysters. Oysters are great because they're like architecture students. They never go to sleep. They continue to work. And they process many tons of garbage a day and turn it into wonderful clean water. But not only was that going to happen in the Gowanus, which is going to be cleaned up by these oysters that she's going to grow there, but once they get a little older, she's going to pick them up and move them out here and create a coastal reef of oysters, because oysters are also, like you people, extremely social. They group almost immediately into structures, which she realized could become wave breakers. And so she uses these oyster reefs in that way. So a very brilliant and, ever since then, quite influential project. There's a lot of oyster work that was already underway, but has intensified since then. So I'm going to skip through these. Foreclosed was the same formula. I think Isla gave such a good introduction to it that I'm going to go over it very quickly. But this was in the context, again, of the financial crisis of a little over a decade ago. And it occurred, Reinhold Martin was already doing research on the mortgage crisis, the foreclosure crisis. And so I thought, take that research that's being created in a university setting and let the museum be the place where it can flourish actually into a design activity and enter into a public debate. And we became fascinated by what we could call the ring of development that was being jumped over in the march of suburbia across all open land. Suburban advertising are the same. They will occupy any site available. They're continually in conquest. But this area of old suburbia of different ages depending on the city chosen, and as Isla said, we chose 5 different megacities and found a kind of fringe city beyond. We wanted to investigate what happened to those areas which had the highest percentage of foreclosures at that point, and to say that the foreclosure, rather than simply being a disaster, could be an opportunity. So here the structural comparison to rising currents was to say, sea level rise, yes, of course it's very dramatically frightening, but what if we look at how we design for it rather than simply against it? And what if in the end, what I also learned in the process of this, what if in the end design proposals create a vision of how the future could be that is so attractive that rather than situations that are completely frightening to us, if you listen to a radio thing about rising currents of sea levels and the like, it's very frightening. What are you going to do? Sell your property, etc. But if you show people ways in which a very comprehensive rethinking of parts of Brooklyn, of Staten Island, of New Jersey could be done, not only are they from there, so they recognize their area in the museum, but they're also saying, that looks like a very interesting place to live. So it's not simply to think about rising sea levels and climate change, but also to think in a positive way about the ameliorative aspect of design. And then also, I'd say part of my kind of manifesto is to demonstrate for public and city officials at the like that architecture and the design professions are not called upon to solve a problem that has been defined by other intellectual or policy matters, but that architecture and design are an integral part of defining the problem in the first place and defining policy to respond to it. So that was, again, extended into this. And again, and I always trying to engineer discussions so one doesn't tend to think of the new urbanists and Michael Sorkin coming together, but we first staged a very vibrant debate to launch the thing. Here you see it with all of the architects and teams before they begin their work. Then we opened up the studios again at PS1. This is Moss's room. And then by this point, we needed to bring in camera crews and recording equipment and the like and have various stagings because the open houses had become more popular on the reputation of rising currents. And I asked then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, if he would like to come. And so he did. And I said, would you give and he had written a policy address that he was going to give on the occasion of this. And first he joined with the public. This is during the open house. Jeannie Gang, I think you recognize some of the characters here, but Jeannie Gang is explaining her project for Cicero, Illinois, to Sean. And then he said, could I start my speech 15 minutes late? I went to the GSD. I want to talk about these projects and not simply the text that I'd brought. He went into an office and rewrote his text. We broadcast that live, and it then became part of launching the debate on the website. Again, the internet is your friend. So there's the finished show. I'm going to skip over these projects. They're published. They're not new. I like to think they're still relevant. Interesting, Jeannie here saying you can't just design the form, you need to redesign the code. So part of redesigning the zoning code for Cicero was part of her absolutely astounding project. This is meant to frustrate you. This is Amal Andros and Work AC for Oregon, very Rem Koolhausian. So here is my conclusion, and then we have a 3-minute coda.
I think somehow this portal of a place for debate, for me, is a kind of bookend to the radical decision to make a museum that you enter through a revolving door and a glass wall, in which the first galleries initially were encountered right inside the museum. That's always been my critique of the Taniguchi building. There's a long delay before you encounter anything on display. There are so many other topics that I would like to see taken up by this format of the activist workshop exhibition. One has to do with the new aging of the population, incredible work being going on. The other has to do with, obviously, the plastic garbage continent in the Pacific Ocean. But I just want to conclude by a little glimpse into an exhibition that closed a little over a year ago, Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, Unpacking the Archive, to show how this model could be extended not simply to architects, but how do you bring architectural historians into the museum and not have them simply appear as someone who is giving to the general public something that they might have taught in the classroom? How could you put architectural historical thinking as well as architectural thinking or design thinking on display? So the background, of course, of this was that we had promised the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, as part of the agreement for transferring the absolutely enormous 2 tractor-trailer loads worth of documents and models from Arizona and Wisconsin to New York, that within 5 years we would stage a major exhibition. I am not a Frank Lloyd Wright specialist, so I began having really strange dreams and sketching things on pads and trying to come up with titles at 3 in the morning, feeling illegitimate. I was really only thinking I would so like to figure out something that so fascinates me, which is this mile-high skyscraper. What is going on there in this design? This guy who hates cities, who wants a horizontal, broadacre city, designing a mile-high skyscraper, 1956, inviting Mayor Daley of Chicago to a press conference when he never had a client, giving a historical scroll on the top, devoting. I mean, if you're going to design a mile-high skyscraper and you're going to paste a bunch of sheets of paper together, why do you give the top third of your scroll, this is an homage to your exhibition, why would you give the top third of your scroll over to text? So I wanted to figure out that text, and I began reading it, and I thought, I have to do, this was the largest exhibition of architecture ever staged at MoMA in terms of square footage, and all I wanted to do was figure out this one drawing. And from that occurred to me, what if I asked 14 other people to pick one object in the archive and to figure it out? And then how would we put their thought process on display the way Rising Currents, Foreclosed, Home Delivery, we tried to put design thinking on display. And so we came up with the idea, I'll show you just one, that's interestingly related to Virginia. This is Mabel Wilson, who's a colleague of mine at Columbia. It wasn't just colleagues and friends. Some people I didn't know at all who were invited. But I called Mabel the day I found this drawing in the archive, now down in Avery, for a Rosenwald school. It claims here to be for Virginia, although there's a California phone number on the piece of paper. Completely confusing, and it's a school for African-American children. So some of you might know Mabel's first book, which is a brilliant book called Negro Building on African-American Pavilions at World's Fairs. She's now working on Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson to you. And I called her upstairs and I said, Mabel, could you come down? Do you know anything about Frank Lloyd Wright and a model school for African-American children? Turned out only one person had ever written on this before, Jack Quinnen, in an article in a relatively obscure place. We hadn't come across it yet. She came down. I said, would you like to figure this out? And this became hers and mine and 14 others. In conclusion, we decided that what we would do is we would ask each person to unpack one drawing, to bring in everything that they looked at and they thought was related that would help explain it, the way you might put together a didactic PowerPoint for a really excellent seminar in a school and lay it out. But the problem was that once that was done and Mabel went home, how do you channel Mabel? Because the gallery only makes sense because it's actually a portrait of Mabel's historical mind cracking a problem. Well, clearly, what we're going to do is everybody is going to, of course this was slightly contrived, reenact their discovery process in the archives. And also, the public will understand that these things on the wall, even though we have to frame them for museum standards, live in an archive. They're not paintings by Magritte. They are drawings, books, letters, all sketches, all of the things that she needs. You can hear this yourself. It's not interactive. If you go, just look up MoMA, Mabel Wilson Wright, and this film will come up. Each gallery paired an object with the historical mind that had cracked the problem. So in homage to Klaus Biesenbach, who with Marina Abramovitz had done an exhibition called The Artist is Present, I thought of this exhibition as The Architectural Historian is Present. And so as my last big exhibition at MoMA, I was able to put on display the design work that is involved in solving or at least putting forth a proposal of a hypothesis and a demonstration of a historical problem. This was an absolutely fascinating discovery of the world of where Frank Lloyd Wright had intervened with Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, Jacob Lawrence, which was in the museum. And all of this stuff was in the museum in various departments. Photographs of Rosenwald schools being designed, Frank Rosenwald grantee Jacob Lawrence in the north, sorry, this is from a French lecture, in the north of the Negro was given better equipment, scholarly school equipment, and the architectural drawings all came together in a kind of cross-media thing to demonstrate what had been at stake and what was the situation that led to this curious archival find. So anyway, a kind of non-conclusion, but I hope I've shown you where this activist model came from, how I think it defines the possibilities of a museum to put on display the process of thinking, both of designers across many disciplines, often working together, of historians, obviously of architects also as artists, and which I think the process is part of what makes a formula for the museum, not simply as a retrospective repository, and that's why I wanted to end with an archive, but actually as an activist for catapulting us into discussions on both things of the urgency of the moment, but also a rediscovery of a figure like Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, who knew that there was anything new to discover about Frank Lloyd Wright? Or for that matter, that you would go to a Frank Lloyd Wright exhibition and it would give you an invitation to think about a very complex, longer history, for instance, of race relations. So that history, which is one of your themes upstairs in the Contemporary Chinese City exhibition. So I'll conclude there. Thank you for the invitation and your patience. Yeah.
Let's open it up for questions. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for a great lecture. I have a quick question, and it goes back to that slide with the text by Peter Blaine. I'm actually referencing the other much longer text about exhibitions versus expositions.
Yeah,
And
that was not the Blake text, that was the other text, right? That's actually Alfred Barr writing, yeah.
Alfred Barr. So, thanks for that citation. I was interested, especially because of your prior books and many of your essays, you talk about expositions, especially in the 19th century. How do you include or not include expositions as part of the architectural problem? Because especially World Expos, that really was full-scale architecture in a lot of cases. But not just the scale and the tectonics that were on display, but the fact that rather than aesthetic or ethical arguments that you'd find in a museum, you also see the kind of technological and economic, I guess, influences behind the World Expos. And how does that kind of figure into the research that you're doing now, especially with your upcoming book?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the very last comment because that's how I was going to answer it. And yes, you understood the distinction that Barr is making between exhibitions, which are things hung on the wall inside of a gallery context, and expositions, by which he means the world's fairs. So I didn't really explain how the book is structured, except to say that the book rejects the notion that architectural exhibitions are started at disadvantage because they're showing representations in images or replacement objects or simulacra or whatever you like, but rather that they obviously are creating some new opportunities for architecture. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been pursued because it's not so easy to do an architecture exhibition. So each chapter of the book is advancing forward in time, but each one is thematically around what is an opportunity created for architecture by the architectural exhibition. So the first one, and I'm going to jump to answer your question, the first one, for instance, very relevant to this, is making architecture a matter of public debate. So the exhibition as a place that displays architecture in order to be debated. So I'm very interested in the moment when what is displayed is not a finished product, but something that's going to be made. And this happens under very, very specific contexts in a number of European countries in the middle of the 18th century, has also to do with the rise of criticism and the press and the like. And each chapter of the book proposes the origins of a format or a function of the architectural exhibition, but then says once it's established, it rarely goes out of date. So it's as relevant that as Voltaire commenting on situations in 1760 in Paris as people responding to Rising Currents as an exhibition in that genre of the exhibition as a catalyst for public debate. The third chapter of the book takes up the origins of the World's Fairs. So it actually starts before the Crystal Palace, because there are a series of industrial exhibitions in the first half of the 19th century on which the Great Exhibition of 1851 is in fact building, with purpose-built exhibitions, and I'm also trying to track at what. And so they're complicated because not only is experimental architecture itself on display, but often architecture is exhibited inside the exposition in many, many different forms. So that third chapter has an awful lot of work to do. And how is it going to work with the overall title, which is Out of Sight, S-I-T-E, Out of Sight in Plain View? Because the very simple hypothesis of the book is that all architectural exhibitions, you'll probably immediately cite an exception, but all architectural exhibitions take something and put it out of sight. It's no longer in its original, so it's dislocated. And it's the activity of dislocating something, decontextualizing something, and recontextualizing it in a new way that is the fundamental. So it's not a history of architectural display, it's a history of architectural exhibition. And my claim is that what I'm interested in is the activity of decontextualizing, recontextualizing, and the opportunity comes from the recontextualization. So the World's Fair originally, there are many, many functions, it's kind of a bit of a hydra to try to tame, but I take up the moment of the evolution of national pavilions, which begins in Paris in 1867. And so that chapter, Out of Sight in Plain View, has to do with exporting your national architecture abroad, and then what is the ramification of the ephemeral event of the World's Fair for architectural debate more largely. And one of the earliest ones is that the World's Fair is often a catalyst for what is the appropriate national style for architecture, for new public buildings, for the public sphere in the 19th century, because you have to make a hyperbolic representation of yourself when you go abroad. So so I call it export architecture. So what happens when you import the export architecture? You get the Hungarians saying, well, if we did that in Paris in 1867, what should our new parliament look like after the 1867 is also the moment of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. So, but of course it's not limited to that, but that is the beginning of my thing. So there are also, it's incredible for model houses. The model house starts in the World's Fair. The earliest model house project is that I know of, is in 1851 at the London Crystal Palace exhibition. Across the street is this model tenement house sponsored by Prince Albert. But that's also out of sight in plain view. Because of the idea of wanting to reform tenement housing in the east of London, you build a model tenement in one of the richest sections of London in order that the investors will see it, buy into it, and then you can export it as an investment model for what was conceived of as a kind more of a kind of public-private partnership. So many, many things come out of the World's Fair, but that was a suggestion of what the work that Chapter 3 of this book has to do. Other questions? Yeah.
I remember seeing the Rosenwald School and feeling like it was kind of an exhibit within the exhibit. The Rosenwald School was like an exhibit within the larger Frank Lloyd Wright exhibit, and it kind of was jarring at the time because it took my attention away and my chronological trip through the overall exhibit. But what I really appreciate about it was that it's bringing contemporaneous issues and contemporary issues also, and a larger context. And just yesterday in the New York Times, there was an article about how in MoMA's new expansion, there's more of an interdisciplinary approach with sculpture and painting combined. And I'm just wondering, how can we expand even beyond that and get more history and background and context in with art exhibits and architecture exhibits so that there's really a more full appreciation of the total environment.
Mm-hmm.
And before I finish, I just want to say the Salmona slide you showed was great. I'd like to put a plug in for bringing a Salmona retrospective to MoMA.
Yes.
There's so much there.
Yeah, I know. I thought it was, when I wanted to do the Latin American show, I thought of it, and, I thought, why am I doing this to myself? This is so complicated, 14 countries, 14 sets of negotiations for export licenses, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't I just do a retrospective on one great architect? Then, of course, there'll be a list of sort of 20 candidates from that period in Latin American countries. But that wasn't going to fit the bill for what I wanted to do with the Latin American project, which was to say that in North America we are so astoundingly ignorant of Latin America. I used to say in sort of press meetings, explaining to the press why I'd done the exhibitions, I have 4 degrees in architectural history, and I have never attended more than 15 minutes of a lecture that had to do with Latin America. And so I wanted to do some kind of big mega thing that was, it had a deliberate built-in bias. I was looking to show things that originated in Latin America, because when we do get Latin Americans, in order to understand how they were building so they could do Corb, or in the North, they were building so they could do SOM. But in fact, I wanted to show it as a place of origins. So taking one sort of brilliant disciple of Le Corbusier and in Colombia and putting that on display wasn't good. I also hoped, and we'll have to see for my successors if that plays out, that it would mean that there would be follow-up things to it, that wasn't a one-time thing, that it was meant to be an invitation for a recalibration of how we understand the transatlantic dynamic in 20th century architecture. Happily, you asked me a different question at the end, so I didn't have to answer the first one. But I'm happy to have a longer discussion with you over what I think are very big differences between this model. And it's interesting that you thought you suddenly found an exhibition within the exhibition, because I thought of the whole thing as an anthology of exhibitions around, sort of 14 curators in search of Frank Lloyd Wright. Because I felt each room was that way. But I think that there's a big difference between this way of working and the way that my colleagues are working for the integrated display. Not better or worse, but they're actually very different ways. In shorthand, many of the other curators would find this approach much too historical. And that has always been a conflict that I've dealt with in MoMA, and I think it's by nature for architectural historians. The architectural history exhibition, the architecture exhibition often has a bigger historical dimension, whereas the MoMA or the Met are not going to put 10 pamphlets or newspaper clippings about Picasso under the Picassos. Right? They would consider that a total distraction. So all of this documentation around one drawing is not the way that the curators in other media in other departments of the museum would find a natural way to work. They would say, oh, it's you A&D people again, you're always working as though this is a history museum, this is an art museum.